So we're just going to toss back a couple of questions and then open it up to you all. So first, the obvious question. Why did Brexit happen? Nobody here, very few people here predicted it would. Even people whose job it is to predict the future missed it. What happened?
Well, very few people in Britain got it right. The big politicians all thought Remain would win comfortably. Most of the press thought Remain would win comfortably. The entire polling industry thought Remain would win comfortably. And it's basically the third year in a row they've all been wrong, because they all thought Scottish would separate from the rest of the UK. Nobody thought Cameron could win a majority in a general election, and now they got this wrong as well. Why did Brexit win? Well, you can throw arguments back and forth, but there are two reasons. The first leads into the second. The first is disconnect, complete disconnect between the attitudes in London amongst a very, very narrow group of people. And I say that because the people in politics now in London, generally, they go to the same handful of schools, they go to the same university, they do the same degree, they leave university at 22, they become researchers in back offices, they become MPs aged 27, cabinet ministers aged 40, and they live their whole world inside this bubble. They marry each other's sisters, and it is the most incredibly tiny little incestuous world. And actually, many of the commentators, much of the media, are kind of interchangeable with them as well. They've never actually met a working class person in their lives, unless they're being chauffeured by them, or served lunch by them, and they're not even very nice to them then. So, complete disconnect. And the real reason Brexit won is those people out there, beyond the M25, the peripheral motorway around London, a lot of them had felt so unrepresented by politics and politicians, they'd completely given up voting. They'd stopped voting. And we've seen quite a big decline in our turnouts from the mid-1970s until today. And in the Brexit referendum, what did we get? 73% turnout. Unbelievable. 73% turnout. And lots of those little people, those ordinary people, thought to themselves, this is one time, our vote can count. They turned out, and it is a victory of the little people.
So this was a shocking victory, as you just explained it.
I wasn't appalled by it.
No, but to the people who married their sisters.
Yeah.
But what I was so struck by was the reaction. So people were very surprised that this happened. And by the way, the system you described was recognizable in Washington. But the reaction beyond that, it wasn't just surprise, it was contempt for the voters who made that decision.
Yes, we were all stupid, old, ignorant, didn't realise the consequences of what we'd done, we would all change our minds, and there was talk of a second referendum. In fact, there was a rally, took place in Parliament Square a week after the referendum, headed up by Bob Geldof, or Sir Bob Geldof. Ghastly man. And I managed a week before the referendum to get a load of our fishing industry to have a flotilla up the Thames to protest outside the Houses of Parliament. And these are working communities up and down the country whose livelihoods have been destroyed by the common fisheries policy, because we now share British fish with the rest of Europe, something that I think is about to change, I'm pleased to say. And who turns up but Bob Geldof and a group of middle upper class millionaires on a big gin palace to basically throw abuse, not just at me, but at these working fishermen and women that have come from all over the country. So I think actually that summed up the referendum. On the one side was the establishment, on the one side were people whose lives are pretty comfortable and pretty good, and on the other side were struggling people. And so yeah, it was really, for the first couple of weeks, endlessly we were told about how badly the Brexit side had behaved, about what a terrible mistake we made, about what huge anger there was at the result. But I think last week has changed all of that. We got a new Prime Minister, not one that I would have chosen, because she backed the wrong side, but she has said Brexit means Brexit, and I think now the country has accepted this is how we voted, and it's now going to happen.
So over here, the analysis was that immigration was a major driver of this vote, and that basically people have come to agree with Powell that your population has changed dramatically, and it's had disproportionately bad effects on people at the lower end of the scale. You didn't mention that. Do you think that's an unfair analysis?
No, I think, look, immigration is very, very important. I mean, what we voted for, we voted to take our country back. We voted to go back to being a normal, independent, democratic nation. And part of that is to control your own borders. We have managed migration for 60 years after World War II, running at about net 30,000 people a year. That figure, net, is now 1/3 a year, and that's if you believe the official figures, which I have to tell you, I don't. And what it came down to, something very simple, but it summed the whole thing up. That should be a British passport. What are the first two words on it? European Union. And there are 508 million people who've got one of these, all of whom can come, live, work and settle in the United Kingdom. And now we voted for Brexit. If the government holds faith with 17.5 million people, we will get back our own British passports. And if people want to come and live and work and settle in the United Kingdom, just as if I wanted to get a job here, apply for a work permit, I'd have to show that I was qualified, I had a skill or a trade to bring to the country, and that's what we moved to. So we haven't done anything radical. All we've done is to become a normal country. That is what normal countries do. That's what we voted for.
Will your immigration levels drop?
Well, we're in charge. And let's put it like this. If by the 2020 general election, we haven't got back our territorial fishing waters, immigration levels haven't fallen, then if you think you've seen fundamental change in British politics over the last month, then you ain't seen nothing yet.
There are concerns, I don't know if they're justified, that the current Prime Minister will slow walk this, and the deals that she cuts, whatever government that is in power at the time cuts with the European Union will be less than we imagine it will be now. Do you think that's a fair concern?
Well, let's see. I don't know. She said Brexit means Brexit, and she's made some very good appointments. Boris Johnson is now our Foreign Secretary. How about that? How about that? I mean, and somebody who, in these troubled times, goes around the world and makes us smile a bit. That can't be a bad thing, can it? She's appointed David Davis, a veteran politician, and somebody who was a board director of a big public company in Britain. And he's in charge of our renegotiations with Brussels. And in terms of developing our international trade relationships, which we've been banned from doing for the last 40 years, she's appointed Liam Fox, who I think is probably the most pro-American politician in Westminster. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot of Liam Fox, and I think the message politically to America is that your oldest and best ally is now free to be that once again. We will be outside a European foreign policy, able to make our own decisions, outside the military structures, which I think threaten on an ongoing basis our cooperation through NATO and elsewhere. And in terms of trade, TTIP has been going through the mill now for several years. There's no immediate prospect of it being signed. I don't think it actually is a very good deal anyway. But the United Kingdom and America could conclude a free trade deal, and we could do it in a matter of months.
So a lot of conservatives in the US believe the lesson of Brexit is that the kind of soft nationalism of the Trump campaign is a global movement, a part of the global movement. Do you think that's right?
Well, I think we've had 2 or 3 decades of leaders in the Western world who have devalued democracy, who've frankly been contemptuous of their own electorates and believe that they jolly well don't know what's good for them, so will impose it from upon high. I think they've overseen a period where we've been into a series of military interventions that frankly have made the world a less safe place rather than a better place. And they've overseen a period of time in which, because of the growth of corporatism and the power of corporatism, has seen the rich get massively richer whilst the average worker's life has declined. So I think what you're seeing, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the Trump phenomenon, I think what you're seeing is a reaction to failure. They failed us, they've let us down, and people now want something different.
The rich have gotten richer, the Iraq War was a disaster. That's not a, strictly speaking, right-wing message. So tell us about the support that you all got from Labour voters. What was it?
Well, the thinking had been for the last 20 years that the only people that were Eurosceptic, the only people that questioned the European project were people on the right of politics. People on the right of the Conservative Party who couldn't live with Conservative leadership and joined UKIP, as if UKIP was kind of way out there on the right-hand end of the spectrum. Actually, the point I tried to make which I think has now come home, is democracy is not a left or right wing issue. It's not about left and right, it's about right and wrong. It's about being able to hire and fire the people that make your laws. Of the Labour vote, 35, maybe 40% of Labour voters defied their party, defied the leadership, and voted for Brexit. And the really odd thing is that the British Labour Party has learnt nothing from this, and it would appear is possibly going to go into the next general election saying, we didn't want that result to happen, we want there to be another referendum. And I think there's a very real chance that by 2020 the Labour Party will cease to be an effective opposition at all, although under Jeremy Corbyn, maybe it's reached that point already.
No learning. It does sound like Washington. So if you were advising Mr. Trump, and you're not, but if you were, what advice would you give him based on what you just learned from the Brexit?
I think, and I go back to this point about ordinary people, the ones who are looked down upon as the little people, who really, almost don't deserve to have the vote, and it's how you deal, how you approach those people. They've had enough of being patronised, they've had enough of being ignored, they want someone who's actually going to have a conversation with them, someone who's actually going to listen to them. And it's irrelevant that Trump is rich. If he is able to go into those communities and to have conversations with people so that they feel he actually gets it. Because that's the problem, isn't it? That's the problem. Brussels doesn't get it, London doesn't get it, and I guess for these people in America, Washington doesn't get it. If you can engage those people, if you can inspire those people, it's the little people that can tip elections and can change the world.
So you said recently, I read, and I think I'm quoting, there is nothing on earth that could ever persuade me to vote for Hillary Clinton. Can you be more specific?
Well, it's just her sense of entitlement. It's as if you've introduced the hereditary system in American politics. I mean, you may as well reinvent the House of Lords here, or something like that. It's that sense of entitlement, and I suspect that under Hillary, you would go on making all the same mistakes that we've talked about earlier in this conversation. But I mean, look, I'm not here. I'm absolutely not here to get directly involved in who you should vote for. That'd be a mistake, and I say that because your president, your beloved president, a man who I now have the utmost admiration for. I'm a big Obama fan. And I know I'll tell you why. Because he came to the United Kingdom, he talked down my country, he talked down our prospects, he told us how to vote, and the British people said, we do not wish to be spoken to by an American president like that. He led to a Brexit bounce. Thank you, Obama.
So the prediction was, by everybody, including the president, that if this were to pass and the UK were to leave, you'd basically be returning to sawdust with no hot water. That it would impoverish the country.
Yeah. Well, the last time I saw the FTSE 100 stock market index, it was 14% higher than it had been back in February during the lows. There are countries all over the world, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, hints from India, countries all over the world wanting to be at the front of the queue. Yeah, are you listening, Obama? Who want to do trade deals with us. And I frankly, sterling, okay, sterling's a bit weak, but sterling's been in a declining market since July 2014. That's because our public finances and our growth are perhaps not where they should be. So all these predictions are doom and gloom. All I can see are some really good news stories out there.
So you run this party, you achieve your goal, and then you leave.
Well, it's not a bad thing to do to leave after you've had a bit of success, is it? And I'm not, I'm not retiring, and I'm not, going to go and sort of move into the hills and not be engaged with politics and current affairs. I'm still a member of the European Parliament, and I shall go to the European Parliament throughout the whole of this process, and I shall make speeches there in my usual friendly, constructive and open manner, which they so adore in that place. So I'll see that process through. I'll do my best to make sure that we hold Theresa May's feet to the fire, and that she holds faith with 17.5 million people who voted for Brexit. What I'm not going to do is go on leading a national political party. You can't do it forever. When I took over as leader of UKIP, we were a very, very small political party. We took that through into forcing Cameron into giving us a referendum. And in 2014, in the European elections, we topped the polls, the first time for over 100 years, that a party that wasn't Labour or Tory won a national election. So I'm just going to, I'll be around, but I'm just taking a little bit of a step back.
So this is my last question before throwing it open, but David Cameron you did force him to call for the referendum. Yeah. Do you think he had any idea, was there any sense on his part that he might lose?
No, there wasn't, and we're back to where we started with this, and here's the underestimated bit of this. You know, we can convince ourselves through conventional media, be it television, radio, or newspapers, important though all these things are. We can convince ourselves that things are in a particular position. What we perhaps don't get is the level to which the growth of the internet and online opinion forming has radically transformed politics. So we're here on a leave.eu platform. Two businessmen set this up, Aaron Banks and Richard Tice, who's with us here today, and they took advice from Jerry Gunster about how to fight referendums, what messaging to use. And you know, what these guys did in the referendum isn't frankly known about or commented on, but videos, clips, ideas, things put out there that were being seen by millions of people. You know, 9 and 10 million people watching some of the videos that were going up on the leave.eu website. And I would say this, that UKIP could never really have got off the ground if it wasn't for the internet, if it wasn't for YouTube. You know, my little, well, I suppose some people call them pantomime acts in the European Parliament. I'm certainly the pantomime villain, aren't I? But that was from 2008. That was beginning to get big traction. It was going out on YouTube and people were seeing it. And I think that there's 1 million people now in the UK signed up to this organisation, and they're not going away. They're not going away. You know, the online presence is there, and I repeat the point. If Mrs May's government does not hold faith with all of those people, we will see a massive change in British politics in 2020, even bigger than what we've seen in the last month.
Is that a threat?
Well, I, of course, I'm almost retired now. But we'll just have to see.
Isabel Oakshott from the Daily Mail. Do you want to start off?
Thank you. Well, I would like to pick up on. Thank you. I'd like to pick up on your almost retired comment. I'm wondering if this is actually a bit more of a sabbatical for you, and maybe, just maybe, you might return to lead UKIP or lead some kind of changed, rebranded UKIP in the run-up to 2020.
Well, I'm not a career politician. I had a proper job. I worked in the commodities business. And it's a bit of an in-joke in London that Americans may not get, but I'm known to like a drink. So I always say that I worked damn hard for 20 years in the private sector, up until lunchtime every single day.
It's true, it's true.
I got involved in politics because 25 years ago, I could see that this European project was not about trade, it was not about being neighbours, it was about the creation of a state with a flag, an anthem, and it wanted a police force and an army and everything else. And I believed in my country, and I believe in democracy. And incidentally, not just for us, but for the rest of Europe too. So I was motivated to get involved in politics on this issue. You know, and I campaigned all through the 1990s and onwards. You know, nearly a quarter of a century I've been doing this. I often thought I would perhaps become the patron saint of lost causes. I've been written off, abused, and goodness knows what. And we've won. We've won the referendum. And I believe the Prime Minister when she says Brexit means Brexit. So I think I've done my bit. Now, obviously, if this was not to happen, UKIP under a different leader might need some support going into 2020, and I would find it irresistible, if the job hadn't been finished, to perhaps put my shoulder to the wheel once again. But I hope it's not necessary.
Is this the beginning of the end of the EU?
Well, that's a big, big question, and I think, you know, right across the EU, I mean, in the south, it's the euro, isn't it, which has caused absolute misery. Youth unemployment rates of 50%. Do you know the Greek economy has now declined by nearly 28%? And you think back to the Great Depression in America, I think can you spare us a dime? That was a 16% fall. 16% fall led to the Great Depression in America. This is now nearly 28%. We're witnessing a country becoming a third world country before our very eyes. It's an absolute tragedy. It's a disaster. Things are not that much better in parts of Portugal. Spain's not in good shape. And Italy, where there's now been no growth, no overall growth for over 20 years, with a banking crisis set to come upon it this summer. In the north, there is massive resentment, particularly what Mrs. Merkel did last year, when she said, please, as many people as possible, can you come? Led to huge resentment. So I suspect, right now it'll be the north that leads the way. I think there will be in the next few years a referendum in Denmark, so we could see Dexit. A referendum probably in the Netherlands, so we could see Mexit, and perhaps a referendum in Sweden, so we could see Sexit.
Which would be your favorite?
Oh, you got me there. No, I mean, look, this project has never had any legitimacy from the start. The founding fathers, as they're called, of the European project, decided they would use arguments about trade and economics to stealthily put people into a political union. They concluded that it was the existence of nation state that had led to war, namely World War I and World War II, and that if they abolished nation state, those terrible things would never happen again. What they miss was that if nation states are democratic, they never go to war with each other. They got their analysis of that terrible tragedy, they got their analysis wrong. And I'm really hoping that the EU does founder, does break up. And I want the United Kingdom to be in a Europe where we trade together, cooperate together. We're like neighbours in the street. We want to have good relations with each other, but we get rid, of Brussels, the bureaucracy, and its absolute contempt for the democratic process.
We have a question. I got that.
Michael, Ryan Heath from Politico. Do you think you can play? Sorry.
Ryan Heath, Politico. Do you think you can play an active role in the development of other referenda in these other European countries, or is it something that you have to leave to those movements themselves to get to where you got in the UK?
Well, one of the joys of not continuing as National Party leader is I'm going to have a little bit more time. So I am going to be travelling around Europe over the course of the autumn, helping and encouraging other independence movements. Not, of course, that I would tell them how to vote. I went to the referendum in the Netherlands that they had on the Ukrainian deal, and I wasn't telling them how to vote. In fact, I said to them, if you think your country should be run by an unelected, corrupt bunch of old men in Brussels, that's entirely up to you. And I wouldn't suggest how to vote. So no, and I'm going to go to Athens in September, and we're going to have a big symposium about alternatives to membership of the Euro and what it would be like to get out of the Euro. So yes, I mean, oddly, perhaps I'm the most pro-European politician of the lot, in that I recognise that Europe is not those dreadful buildings in Brussels and those awful people and that flag and that anthem, but the real Europe actually is the most diverse piece of land of the whole of the continent. You travel 100 miles in Europe, you get different languages, different wines, different cheeses, different histories, different peoples. And we should be celebrating a Europe, a diverse Europe of independent nation states. And if I could do anything to help that, then I will.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Ed Stewart from Wing Global Partners. You can hear me anyway. On that diverse group of nation states of Europe, if you would take us a step back or a step forward from where we are right now in Brexit, talk a little bit about the security and stability of Europe as a whole, what we can look forward to. Europe has not always been a diverse, peaceful group of nation states. And tell us a little bit that are concerned about the security arrangements, what you see moving Europe forward in Europe, and what Britain's role would be in that, and if any, what the U.S. role would be in it.
Well, I mean, we've been told that it is this European political union that will make us safer and more stable. And actually what we're seeing is a rise in some countries of real political extremism as a response. You know, why is the Golden Dawn Party in Greece, and they, by the way, call themselves a neo-Nazi party, they're very proud of it. You know, why are they doing well? Well, actually, if you take away from people the most powerful thing they possess in a free society, namely their ability through the ballot box to influence and determine their own future, and to hire and fire the people that do it, then don't be surprised if people go for extremes or direct action or violence or anything else. So the idea that somehow we're living in a wonderfully happy and peaceful European Union, you know, the facts do belie that completely. I think what Europe, I think there are two things in terms of security. You know, the first is, does a single European foreign policy backed up by a single European army, is that likely in terms of security and stability to be a good thing? I would argue probably quite the reverse. And I think whatever one thinks about the Ukraine, the fact is that it was EU politicians, and indeed people like Mr. Cameron, who spent a decade saying we want the Ukraine to join the European Union and to join NATO, and actively encouraged the overthrow of a democratic, maybe corrupt, but a democratically elected leader. And they were surprised when Putin reacted. You know, if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised that you're going to get a reaction of some kind. I hope that what Brexit does is to effectively make any ideas of a European army frankly laughable, given the tiny defence commitments around the rest of the continent. So I have not viewed the growth of all of this as being good for stability. And as far as America is concerned, this is really interesting. You know, Obama saying how wonderful the EU was and how it was all in our, you know, in the interest of all of us. Actually, Brussels hates America. It hates the USA. It hates everything this country stands for. And you know, I remember, you know, when I was first there, when I was first elected to that place in the first week, I met a German politician called Elmar Brok, who is chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, and quite a significant European politician. And Brok said to me, Nigel, you don't understand. On our own, none of us are big enough. Only by being together, economically and militarily, can we challenge and overtake America. And history shows that when people build empires to try and be bigger than somebody else, far from leading to security, it probably gives the opposite effect. And just lastly, if I can, I know there is some debate here about NATO. I know that Trump has talked in quite negative terms about NATO. I'm actually pro the concept of NATO. I'm pro the concept of nation states having a cooperative club within which they work together. I just think NATO perhaps needs to redefine itself. And citing the Ukraine in this answer shows you that NATO hasn't quite worked out, post the end of the Cold War, what it's all about.
But before we go to the next question, what do you think of Donald Trump? There are no journalists here, so you can be totally...
Well, he's taken on the establishment. He's indeed taken on the establishment within his own party. You know, he's dared to talk about things that other people would rather were swept under the carpet and not discussed in polite society. And that's in a sense why he's doing well. There are one or two aspects, one or two things he said that make me a little bit uncomfortable, but perhaps that's a cultural thing. You know, I think one of the mistakes I feel we must not make is we must not allow ourselves to look at entire segments of the population as being all good or all bad. I think that's a huge mistake. I think there's good and bad in all of us. And I think if Western politics, as it changes, chooses to effectively demonize an entire religion, then I think we'll make things worse for ourselves, not better for ourselves. And you know, we've got to stop appeasing. We've got to start standing up for our own cultures. Of course we have. We've got to take a very serious approach to terrorism and extremism, but to whether by accident or design, to get into a position where we think a whole religion is bad, I think it's quite a dangerous place to be.
Yes.
Nigel, my name's Mike Hurst. I'm an alternate delegate from the great state of Mississippi. You are the leader, or were the leader of the Independence Party. What effect do you think Brexit will have on potential Scottish independence?
Oh, look, this is one of the biggest nonsenses that exists. You know, the Scottish National Party say they're for independence. They're not. They want to separate from the United Kingdom and be part of the European Union. We've just won an independence referendum. June the 23rd is our Independence Day. And yet the Scots want to sign back up to it. It isn't going to happen. There was a referendum on this in 2014 when conditions were a lot more favourable for separatism, and the whole economic agenda that Alex Salmond, as the leader then, put to the Scottish people was based on oil priced at $113 a barrel. It is now $47 a barrel, and unless you're drinking a lot of moonshine, you realise there isn't much prospect of it getting back to $100 a barrel. The economics of it are finished. And anyway, how would she explain to the Scottish people, I'm going to Brussels today to sign a treaty to commit us to EU membership, within which is a clause that commits Scotland to joining the euro? I mean, it would be like getting on the Titanic just before it finally went under the waves. Forget it, it isn't going to happen.
Jim Walsh, Republican, former member of Congress, and along the same lines with Ireland. I spent a lot of time during the peace process, Belfast Agreement, and so on. So every politician in Ireland, on the island, north and south, has now weighed in on EU versus UK versus Republic. Enda Kenny yesterday suggested that he would be open to a border poll at some point. Is this just mischief, or do you think there's actually something to, since Northern Ireland voted 56–57% for retain?
Well, Northern Ireland did marginally vote, you're right, for Remain. They did so chiefly because Sinn Féin, the nationalists, have completely sold out. It could be something to do with all the money that Brussels gives them, I don't know. Look, I think when we talk about Ireland, the Republic, Enda Kenny and others give the impression that Ireland's very pro the European Union. Really? Twice in the last 15 years, in referendums in the Irish Republic on European treaties, the people have said no. And they've been forced to vote again until they get it right. I think there is a well of Eurosceptic feeling in Ireland that is enormously strong. Do you know something? When they see, a couple of years down the road, that the United Kingdom is operating quite well, has re-engaged with its friends all over the world, and crucially, has got its fishing waters back, I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised. It won't be the first, but in the least bit surprised to see, you will now see, I think, a much bigger appetite for Euroscepticism in Ireland, in Dublin. I'm certain.
Congressman King?
Yes, thanks. Steve King, Iowa. And I'd like if you would talk a little bit about, if you could talk a little bit about the growth of the conservative parties across Europe, from the United Kingdom all the way across in Denmark and Holland and France and Germany and on over to what we anticipate is taking place, Austria and Hungary. To get a sense of that, is there a linkage of all of that and that common cause, and where do you think it goes?
Yeah, I mean, there is big political change going on. In general, in the north of Europe, it's parties that we would say were on the right, and in the south of Europe, it's parties that we would say are on the left. So Syriza in Greece won a general election on an agenda to stand up to Brussels, and the Prime Minister came to visit the European Commission and the other leaders and just collapsed, just capitulated. In Spain, it's Podemos, you know, a sort of people's street movement on the left that were growing, and I would anticipate that those left-wing parties in the south will continue to grow, and that the euro and the misery that it's caused to populations will be the key. In the north of Europe, this is actually far more to do with identity, it's far more to do with democracy, and it's far more to do with the mistakes that Mrs. Merkel that were made last year. Generally, we call these parties right-wing parties. So the French National Front, we call a right-wing party. Actually, if you study the economic agenda, it's incredibly left-wing and very, very statist. So it's difficult to define all of this, but what is for certain is that in Austria, for example, you may have seen there was a presidential election that took place in Austria. It turned out that there'd been cheating on the postal voting. There's going to be a rerun of that presidential election taking place on October the 2nd next year. Nobody would bet now against the Freedom Party winning that presidential election. We've got the French elections next year, the French presidential elections next year, the first round in April, the second round in May. I'd be very surprised if Marine Le Pen didn't win the first round in April. And frankly, after Nice, I think it's very difficult to read what the French opinion may be. But just think about this, that the Prime Minister, not the President, the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, went to Nice on Monday of this week, to lay a wreath on the spot where this atrocity had happened. There were 40,000 people in the crowd. They booed him. They booed the French Prime Minister at a very somber event. And that kind of tells you something really, really big is going on. And I could go on, in Finland there's a movement in Finland which has been at on near 20% of the polls. In Sweden, there's change. Do they link together? Yes and no is the answer to that. Yes and no. They're all very individualistic, and they're all very much catered for the needs of those individual countries, which in a sense proves my point that Europe is about different nation states. I think we're in for some. If Brexit was a shock to Mr. Juncker and his friends in Brussels, I think there may be bigger shocks to come.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes.
I'm Chris Senek with Blueprint Advisors. I have a bit of trepidation mentioning nanny, but it's not in a British context. But in our platform that we just adopted on Monday, in the government reform section, the first sentence reads that overregulation is the quiet tyranny of the nanny state. I'm just curious, what lessons from your campaign, from the Leave campaign, from EU red tape, overregulation, what lessons could we learn from where you accomplished the overregulation of the EU?
Well, one of the reasons why voting for Brexit was important was that when a law comes to us from the European Union, and people argue, but something like 60 to 70% of UK law every year comes to us from the EU. When the EU make a law, whether it's a good law or a bad law, there's nothing the voter can do ever to change that law. Nothing. You can vote for a new parliament, you can vote for new MEPs, but once something is European law, there is no democratic mechanism of changing it, which goes to the heart of why democratically it was right to vote for Brexit. The European Union regulates and legislates in a truly astonishing manner. And one of the very important group of people that did vote for Brexit were the self-employed. The self-employed, the sole trader, the people who, you're running a small company, but you're expected to maintain the same levels of legislation on employment law, health and safety, and the environment as Unilever.
Wait, can you give us some? Can you appall us? Can you shock us? Can you enrage us and make us want to vote again for Brexit for some of these?
Vote again for Brexit? Well, it's just, frankly, it's the cost of environmental legislation. So for example, as we've gone on funding wind technology, whether there's some fans of wind technology in the room, I'm not. I think it's loathsome, and it doesn't work. So let's say you're a small manufacturing company. All right, you're a small manufacturing company. You are now paying a 20% surcharge on your electricity bill as a direct result of our agreements through the European Union to subsidise renewable energy. It's just one example. And often the question gets asked, why do big businesses support it? Dead easy. Why does Goldman Sachs support the European project? Easy. It owns it. It owns it. It's able effectively to make its own laws for its own business to freeze out small and medium-sized competitors. The EU has been one of the most gigantic successes for corporatism, and I believe in free market capitalism. I believe in people being allowed to be successful, to make money. That's what creates jobs, that's what creates innovation, and we now have a fantastic opportunity as a United Kingdom just to begin to lift little bits of burden of regulation off our 5.2 million small businesses, and that will lead to real, genuine economic growth. But you know something? I'm excited about this.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about this. I think we're going to have a better, stronger, fitter, healthier country.
A couple more questions, yes ma'am.
June DeHart with Manhattan Phelps, and I really have enjoyed your commentary today. Your comments, actually now I have like 3 questions. The funny thing in reaction to what you just said was one of the reporters right before Brexit said it was all about tea kettles, toast, and hair dryers. So I got a real chuckle out of that. In talking about the conservative movements around Europe, how is Germany going to react to all of this? And they're facing their own issues with massive immigration and some of the problems that have come from that. So what's going to be their response? And then lastly, could you just preview a little of what to expect as the UK begins this process of exiting out of the EU? What does it really all mean, and why should it take years to do it?
Yeah, no, fair point. Germany, complicated Germany. Complicated because there is still nearly 75 years on, there is still a lot of guilt in Germany about that particularly barbarous period in the early 1940s. And so it's been very difficult in Germany for anybody to say anything that was positive about Germany, about their nationality, about their flag. It's been seen as a source of embarrassment, whereas EU nationalism has been fine for the Germans. And I've seen them. You know, when they play that European anthem in the European Parliament, which incidentally I do not stand for. But I see them absolutely bolt upright, rigid to attention. So EU nationalism has been acceptable for German politicians, whereas German nationalism has been considered to be shameful and wrong. And so, and really, it's still there. 75 years on, it's still there. There is still extreme guilt about what they did, about what their grandparents' generation did. Now there is a Eurosceptic party that's off the ground in Germany. It's called the AfD, the Alliance for Deutschland. They have made some progress. They did very, very well in a regional poll just recently. But believe me, one thing I can tell you is when you start a new insurgent political party, it is not plain sailing. You get splits, you get fractures, you get divisions, and that's exactly what the AfD are going through right at this moment in time. So it's there, it's a vehicle for people to vote for, but it doesn't, I know all parties have their problems, but insurgent parties have far bigger problems than established parties, and they've got a problem with that. How does it all look going on? What's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is you guys are going to see a lot of Liam Fox, right, who I've explained already through the Atlantic Council and everything else, is a genuinely pro-American British politician, and he is going to be reaching out here in America, and I hope that gets reciprocated, and I very much hope that people like Mr. Froman, your so-called trade negotiator, are removed from the scene, and we get somebody altogether more positive about engaging with us. Why does this need to take years? It doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, at one point in this campaign, Cameron said it could take us 10 years to sort all of this out. We as a nation, our leaders, have lost self-confidence in our ability as a country to do anything. And so we currently have no trade negotiators in our country, because for 40 years we've been happy for other people to do it for us. So yeah, we've got to go and poach some people from Switzerland and Singapore and other parts where they're very good at this. The answer is, this does not need to take forever. I know there were questions earlier about what's going to happen in 2020 and what my involvement may or may not be. Provided the British government is resolute, we can sort out the European question, we can re-engage with you, our friends in the Commonwealth, and actually we'll look back on this in years to come and we'll say all we did was to end an abusive relationship, to opt for freedom, and to opt for Britain being a full global trading nation.
One last question. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Justin Schwab from the law firm Baker and Hostetler. I have a strategic question. You credited the victory of Leave in large part with mobilizing people who did not regularly participate in the electoral process. If you look at the polls right now, the vast majority of them here suggest that Donald Trump's going to have a very hard time in a few months. But there are a good 40 or 45% of eligible voters who do not regularly vote in presidential elections. Can you, I know you don't want to advise him, but can you just generally give a few specific words of advice on how to engage non-traditional voters?
Well, you don't vote or you give up voting if you think it's a complete and utter waste of time. If you think regardless of which party gets in, actually, your lot isn't fundamentally going to change, you know, then you start voting. And I mean, we certainly, in British politics, you know, we finished up with 3 social democrat parties, all in the middle, and frankly, you couldn't put a cigarette paper between any of them. And that's why there was the space and the gap for UKIP, if you like, to come along and shock and probably appall the existing political class. So people have to think it's worth it. And they have to think that the person they're voting for genuinely believes and understands what their problems are and has something. You know, to overpromise is always a huge mistake. But to actually say, I get it, folks, and I'm going to try and do this for you, you know, that's what you need to get people down, you know, to actually voting on that day. And I you know, either the chemistry between that individual or group of individuals, either it works or it doesn't. You know, you can't learn this in a book, but you know, if the man that you're backing is able to do that, no, you're a lawyer, you're being neutral. You'll take fees from anybody. But either, you know, he's either able to do that or he isn't. But I, you know, in those last couple of weeks, as I was touring around the country, you know, people were coming up, women coming up to me, men coming up to me, saying, I've never voted in my life, Nigel, but I'm going out there on June the 23rd. I want it to be our Independence Day. You know, they could see that it was worth doing something. They believed that if they did it, we might just topple the establishment and change things forever. And do you know what? We did. Thank you very much.
All right, so talk to me a little bit about the rise in nationalism that we're seeing globally. So many people are saying it's racism, xenophobia, rather than citizens wanting to rise up, reclaim their sovereignty from global powers. So what do you really see is behind Brexit and other countries?
Well, what I've seen is several decades of big politics, big government, treating democracy with contempt, treating anybody that was even vaguely patriotic about their country and their identity as somehow being really absolutely awful. I mean, what a dreadful thing for people to do. I've seen an international political order that has led us into an endless series of foreign wars, which in many cases have made things worse, not better. And at the heart of all of it, corporatism, the big international businesses virtually owning politics, and the rich getting massively richer and the ordinary Joe being left behind. So things have gone badly wrong, and I think people have become very unhappy about this. They recognise this, and they're beginning to find political opportunities to express that. And Brexit was exactly that. Brexit was, despite everybody threatening us, everyone telling us it'd be a terrible mistake, the British people said, to hell with you, we want to take back power over our lives. And that's actually what it's about. That's what this reassertion of democracy is really about.
Right, and we saw so much fear being put out there, so many naysayers, so many doomsdayers, really kind of warning the rest of the world, don't you dare think about reclaiming your sovereignty. What do you see would be the effect of Brexit for the world?
Well, what Brexit shows, firstly, is that any campaign can win. Any campaign can win. You can beat the big guys, you can beat the establishment if you inspire ordinary people to engage in a democratic process. That's the first thing. And secondly, I just have a feeling that things aren't ever going to be quite the same again.
Yes.
I think it's such a fundamental, it's not just a British event, it's not just a European event, it is an event of global significance. And that's good. We need change. I mean, unless people think that voting can change things, why would you ever bother to vote?
Absolutely. And so now you're here in Cleveland at the Republican National Convention. Donald Trump was just named as the Republican nominee. Are you here to endorse Donald Trump?
No, I'm not, and that would be a terrible mistake. You know, after all, President Obama engaged himself in British politics and had the counter effect. I'm not an American. I'm not an American voter. I'm here watching, a part of your democratic process with great interest. But I'm also here bringing a message from the Brexit campaign that if you can reach the hearts and minds of ordinary people, you can change anything.
And what do you think a Donald Trump administration would bring not only to our relationships with our oldest ally, but to the rest of the world?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, clearly Trump is fighting on an America First ticket, and there's a feeling that maybe the interests of ordinary Americans need putting higher up the food chain than perhaps they've been under the last couple of administrations. So we'll have to see. As far as we're concerned, I mean, look, let's be honest about it. You know, the UK and the USA, we are pretty much, and we have been for a long time, the closest allies in the world. We've stood together through some pretty heavy stuff. And frankly, if we hadn't done that in the 20th century, the world would be a much darker place than it is today. I believe that what we've done is to free ourselves from this political club, and we can now come and talk to you about doing trade deals. We can talk to you about foreign policy cooperation. There are lots of things we can now have a proper conversation about. And when President Obama said that the United Kingdom would be at the back of the queue, it was an absolutely disgraceful thing to say. And I hope we're somewhere near the front of your queue, or line, as you normally say.
Yes, well, we were all very excited, stayed up late to celebrate along with you all. What advice can you offer us here in the U.S. in regards to open immigration, as well as secret trade deals? Any advice?
Well, the immigration thing is different because your chief problem, as I see it, is actually illegal immigration, whereas ours, oddly, was legal immigration. Ours was the entire European Union being able to come to our country. But the lessons are the same. Unless your citizens feel that you as a government are in control and have a strategy, then they will become contemptuous of you. So different reasons, but similar result. And this stuff does matter to people. It matters to people hugely.
Okay, and one last question. You bravely led Britain out of the EU. Do you think that Donald Trump could lead that type of resistance here in the U.S.?
That's for you to judge. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, clearly, he has taken on the establishment in Washington and inside his own party, and I'm going to be fascinated to see tomorrow what he's got to say and kind of how he says it too.
I'm just wondering, what's going to happen to the movement if you go?
Well, I'm not going completely. I'm not disappearing. I'm not moving up into the mountains to live in a shed. I mean, I'm going to go on being an MEP until we exit the European Union and overseeing that process and commenting on it. And I will, if I can, hold the government's feet to the fire to make sure that they hold faith with the people that have voted. And I'm still going to be around and commenting and saying things and doing things and supporting the party. You can't be leader forever. Nobody can be leader. No matter who you are, you can't do it forever. I've been doing this a hell of a long time. I've dedicated 25 years of my life to getting back the democratic independence of our country. We've won this referendum. I think now was the right time.
You're not retiring fully, you're just...
I am not retiring. I'm not going to go and sit and, as I say, up in the hills and smoke a pipe all day, no.
Are you worried that the globalists are going to try to hijack this Brexit?
They can try if they want to. but it won't work. Those people who made their minds up to vote for Brexit, despite all the threats that they were getting from the international community, the political, the US president even came to London to tell them what they should do. And they made their minds up, they struck out, they voted for freedom. That's what they voted for. If they don't get it, if they're betrayed, then you'll see even bigger political shocks than we saw with the Brexit result.
Are you worried about your personal safety at all?
Well, whether I am or not, I don't discuss that sort of thing in public. It doesn't make sense.
Understandable. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
talking to me.